It begins with a man who wanted nothing. No fame, no family, no future. A man who simply walked away. July 1986, just after sunrise, a 20-year-old named Christopher Knight drove a Subaru deep into the Maine woods. He passed the last gas station, the last mailbox, the last paved road. The world was slipping behind him, mile by mile, until the trees swallowed the sky and silence settled across the windshield like fog. Knight turned off the engine, removed the keys, and without leaving a note, stepped into the forest. No goodbye, no plan, no trace. It would be 27 years before anyone saw him again. No one noticed his disappearance at first. Knight was quiet, painfully shy, a former high school tech kid with no criminal record and nothing resembling drama in his past. He wasn't running from debt, heartbreak, or enemies. When people finally realized he was gone, it simply became one more unsolved shrug in rural Maine. Another young man who vanished into the vast green nowhere. But somewhere in those woods, Knight was learning how to live like a ghost. The forest closed around him, dense with pine, moss, and a darkness that stayed even during the day. He carried a tent, a few cans of food, and a whispered belief that he no longer belonged in the world he left behind. Weeks passed, his food ran out. He refused to light a fire because smoke meant exposure. At night, temperatures dropped low enough to burn the lungs. He slept curled beneath a tarp, listening to the chirp of insects, the crack of branches, the soft movements of unseen animals. Hunger twisted through him until he understood the truth. To stay alive, he would have to take from others. And so began the quiet, methodical thefts that would define the legend of the North Pond Hermit. At first, he moved clumsily, breaking twigs, leaving footprints, almost tripping alarms. But Knight was meticulous. He studied patterns. He learned when cabins were empty, how to avoid motion sensors, which foods spoiled slower, which brands of propane burned with less detectable scent. He became dangerous not because he wanted to hurt anyone, but because he became astonishingly good at not being found. The locals started to notice. Batteries vanished, sleeping bags, frozen dinners, hundreds of dollars of meat. Entire coolers disappeared in the night. Nothing violent, nothing destroyed, just gone. They changed locks, they bought bigger dogs, they left lights on, installed cameras, reinforced windows. It didn't matter. Every defense they built, Knight calmly, silently bypassed. He studied the terrain like a topographical map etched into his mind. He padded barefoot over pine needles to soften his steps. He moved only on moonless nights. He stole just enough to survive, but never so much that anyone would assume a human was living nearby. At least, not at first. The thefts grew stranger. Books vanished, radios disappeared, odd brands of snacks were taken while more expensive items were left behind. Whoever this was, he wasn't just stealing, he was selecting. And gradually the idea formed among the lakeside residents. Someone was out there. Someone who watched, waited, entered their cabins like a phantom. They began to leave notes for him. "Tell us what you need. Are you okay? Please stop." But Knight never replied. He had come to live in stillness, and notes were too close to conversation. What he wanted was silence. In his hidden camp, a place so well concealed that search parties had walked within 20 feet of it without noticing, Knight built a world from the scraps of the society he'd abandoned. Tarps lashed between boulders, stacks of propane tanks, a mattress propped on crates, pans blackened by use but never by fire, books lined in plastic to protect them from rain. He read constantly. History, philosophy, adventure novels. Every stolen book a window into the world he refused to rejoin. He told no one, wrote nothing, documented nothing. For 27 winters he survived without once lighting a fire. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees, cold sharp enough to shatter branches. Ice creeped across the inside of his tent. He would wake with his breath frozen in his beard, his sleeping bag stiff as armor. And still, he refused to create even a single plume of smoke that could give him away. Over the years, the locals' feelings twisted from annoyance to fear, then back to something more complicated. Imagine returning to a lakeside cabin only to find the door gently latched behind you. a candy wrapper on the floor, a missing frying pan, a new padlock you didn't purchase hanging on the door because someone preferred it closed tightly. Thefts continued, always precise, always bloodless. Police investigated, hunters searched, locals formed vigilante patrols. But night drifted through their traps like a shadow in fog. At night, he stood along the tree line and listened to families laugh inside their warm, bright cabins. He overheard arguments, toasts, birthday songs. He watched children grow from a distance, season after season, like characters in a play he could never join. He was invisible, yet intimately tangled in the lives of people who didn't even know what he looked like. He knew their routines, their diets, their favorite snacks, the brands of their batteries, but they knew only his myth, the North Pond Hermit. A figure who wandered in and out of their homes without ever once encountering them face to face. For nearly 3 decades, he survived without speaking a single word to another human. 27 years of silence. 27 years without hearing his own voice reflected back at him. The world changed, 9/11 happened, the internet exploded, cell phones replaced landlines, presidents came and went, and Knight remained frozen in the same moment of withdrawal he'd chosen in 1986. He had not seen his family. He had not seen a doctor, not a dentist, not a mirror. He lived as if outside time itself, a man suspended between a society he didn't trust and a wilderness that slowly, relentlessly tried to kill him. But no phantom stays hidden forever. By 2013, the thefts had grown so consistent that one resident, the director of a nonprofit camp, decided to set a trap. He installed a forgotten brand of surveillance system, old enough, obscure enough, and silent enough that Knight didn't expect it. And one night at 2:30 a.m., in the stillness of early spring, Christopher Knight slipped inside the camp kitchen for food. A small LED blinked, nearly imperceptible, and for the first time in 27 years, a camera captured the face of the North Pond Hermit. The authorities moved quickly. They planned the capture with the seriousness of a tactical operation. Knight had evaded them for decades, outsmarted systems, bypassed alarms. They knew he was meticulous, intelligent, cautious. They waited until the ice had melted enough for their vehicles to move silently, until the air was warm enough to avoid crunching frost underfoot. Then one night, as Knight approached the storage building in search of food, an officer stepped out of the dark and spoke a simple sentence. "Hey, Chris." Knight froze. The world, which had been nothing but wind and pine needles for decades, suddenly filled with human sound. He surrendered immediately. No fight, no run, no attempt to escape. For a moment, he simply stood there, a thin, pale man with a beard like tangled wire, blinking as though awakened from a long, impossible dream. When they asked him how long he'd been out there, he answered quietly, 27 years. His voice cracked from disuse. Some officers later said it sounded like a man learning to speak again. Once in custody, Knight explained his story with an almost painful bluntness. He wasn't a monk, not a survivalist, not a criminal mastermind, just a man who didn't know how to live among people. He never lit fires because he feared being seen. He never approached anyone because he believed he had nothing to say. He stole because he couldn't farm, couldn't hunt, couldn't risk discovery. The forest had become his entire reality, and everything beyond the tree line felt like a distant world he'd left behind a lifetime earlier. Reporters descended on the town. The legend they'd whispered about for years had a face now, and the face was unexpectedly ordinary. The world wanted explanations. Why leave? Why stay gone? Why no fire? Why no contact? Why build a life from the edges of someone else's? Knight gave no poetic speeches, no philosophical monologues. He said only that he felt a little ashamed, and that solitude had given him what he needed. When a psychologist asked him how he endured the crushing winters, he simply said, "I put my mind to it." The courts debated what to do with a man who had stolen thousands of dollars of food and supplies, but harmed no one, damaged nothing, and survived by disappearing. Residents were split. Some wanted him punished. Others felt compassion. After all, for decades he had been part of their lives in a strange, spectral way. He had eaten their food, read their books, borrowed their tools. He knew their homes more intimately than many of their neighbors did. When night finally returned to civilization, he walked into a world that had long stopped waiting for him. Cars buzzed with touch screens. People carried the internet in their pockets. Information moved at the speed of light. Night blinked in fluorescent grocery store aisles, overwhelmed by the abundance he could now take legally, but struggled to understand emotionally. His old identity no longer fit, as if he'd stepped into someone else's clothing. He had missed birthdays, deaths, entire cultural shifts. He didn't know the world, and the world didn't know him. Years later, his story still hangs in the air like campfire smoke over North Pond, an improbable intersection of solitude and society, survival and surrender. A man who vanished not because he was hunted or broken, but because silence felt more natural than conversation. A man who lived in the forest longer than some people endure marriages, careers, entire chapters of life. A man who left no legacy except the echo of his absence. And in the end, after 27 years hidden in the folds of the Maine wilderness, the most remarkable part of Christopher Knight's story isn't how he survived, but how quietly he slipped away from a world that never knew he was gone, and how quietly he returned to a world that still doesn't fully understand why he left. He walked into the woods a stranger. He came out a legend, and somewhere in that vast, cold silence, the truth of his disappearance lingers, quiet, unresolved, and impossible to fully comprehend, like the last footsteps of a man who once decided that life made more sense in the dark.